In the early months of the Pacific War, the name Chūichi Nagumo made the entire U.S. Navy wary. He was not a pilot, nor a strategist, yet he commanded the most powerful carrier force Japan had ever sent to sea. From the dawn attack on Pearl Harbor to the sweeping blows across the Indian Ocean, Nagumo appeared as a silent but sharp shadow, a man capable of turning 6 aircraft carriers into a single strike that could pierce through American defenses in a matter of hours. Even U.S. officers who survived Pearl Harbor admitted that they had never faced a commander as strict and precise as he was. But this very man, in the flames of Midway, showed the world the fragility of an era on the verge of collapse. Nagumo embodied the strength of Japan at its peak and the full stop to an entire naval doctrine as the tides of war shifted too quickly. This is the story of a respected yet controversial admiral, the man who ignited the storm that shook the entire Pacific. Rear Admiral Chūichi Nagumo was born in 1,887 inches, Yonezawa, a small region in northern Japan, into a samurai family that maintained discipline and loyalty as part of daily life. As Japan entered the 20th century with ambitions to build a new naval power, Nagumo enrolled in the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and graduated in 1908. His early career was not tied to aircraft carriers or aviation, as people often imagine, but to destroyers and the traditional tactical doctrines of the Navy. He rose as a strict officer, absolutely obedient, and inclined toward defensive thinking, rather than taking risks. At that time, Japan was still intoxicated by its victory over Russia in 1905, and most officers, like Nagumo, came of age in an era when naval battles still relied on battleship guns, ship speed, and formation maneuvering. This would eventually become both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness in the years to come, as the era of aircraft carriers began to change the game entirely. In the 1,930 seconds, Japan expanded its military power across the Pacific and advanced into China. This was the period when militarism reached its peak, and the Navy became an important symbol of national strength. Nagumo took part in several operations in China, but he was not a prominent figure in grand strategy. What made his superiors trust him was not bold creativity, but the opposite. He rarely did anything outside the textbook. To Japan's upper military leadership, that meant safety and stability in executing orders. It was for this very reason that he was given command of Japan's most powerful carrier force, just as the war with the United States was about to begin, even though he himself had never been a specialist in naval aviation. In November 1941, when tensions between the United States and Japan had reached their peak, Japan's first carrier fleet quietly gathered at Hitokapu Bay, a remote base in the north. The 6 largest aircraft carriers Tokyo possessed, Akagi, Kaga, Soru, Hiru, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, were all under the command of Rear Admiral Chūichi Nagumo. This was the most powerful force Japan had ever sent to sea, yet its commander carried more anxiety than excitement. The strategy for the Pearl Harbor attack was the idea of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who believed that only a powerful, preemptive blow could make the United States hesitate. Nagumo, however, did not feel the same. Having come of age in the era of battleship warfare, he viewed carrier operations as a field full of risks dependent on weather, intelligence, and luck, far more than he was willing to accept. In the secret meetings before departure, Nagumo expressed that if the operation failed or was exposed, the entire carrier force, Japan's most valuable asset, could be ambushed in the middle of the Pacific with no support. He also feared that such a large-scale attack would unite the United States even more, rather than shake its resolve as many Japanese officers hoped. Nagumo's perspective was so cautious that some saw it as pessimism, inconsistent with the offensive spirit. But he still obeyed orders. In the Japanese military culture of that time, absolute loyalty to orders outweighed any personal opinion, and Nagumo understood that his task was not to debate strategy but to execute Yamamoto's plan as precisely as possible. Therefore, when the fleet departed Hitokapu and headed toward Hawaii, Nagumo entered the operation with the mindset of a soldier carrying out his assigned duty, rather than someone who fully believed in the strategy he was entrusted with. He knew the power in his hands was immense, but he also clearly saw the risks that many younger officers did not consider. It was an inner struggle between duty and fear of the consequences, and it became the foundation for every decision he would make at Pearl Harbor. At dawn on the 7th of December, 1941, under the cold mist of the North Pacific, the 6 aircraft carriers of the 1st Air Fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Chūichi Nagumo, quietly approached Hawaii. The operation was kept so secret that even many sailors on board did not know they were about to begin the greatest battle of their lives. As the first aircraft took off, Nagumo stood motionless on the command bridge, his eyes following every movement, maintaining a calm demeanor that many younger officers considered too cold for a moment that could change the course of history. The first attack wave reached Pearl Harbor at nearly 8 a.m. This force included torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighters assigned to control the skies. The torpedo bombers had been specially modified to operate in the harbor's shallow waters, skimming just above the surface before releasing their torpedoes at the American battleships moored below. Within minutes, USS Oklahoma was struck multiple times and capsized. USS West Virginia and USS California sank. Above them, the dive bombers dropped their bombs directly onto the decks of the ships and defensive installations. Zero fighters swept across the Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island airfields, destroying dozens of American aircraft still parked on the ground. The entire area was engulfed in smoke and fire within minutes, leaving the U.S. forces stunned and unable to mount an immediate response. About an hour later, the second attack wave arrived. This wave consisted of more dive bombers and high-level bombers, focusing on targets that had not been destroyed in the first strike. They continued attacking the remaining operational battleships, while striking deeper into military facilities, such as hangars, command posts, and coastal defense positions. USS Nevada attempted to head for the harbor entrance to escape the bombardment, but after being hit, she was forced to beach herself to avoid sinking and blocking the channel. Although American anti-aircraft defenses were able to respond more effectively this time, the second wave still inflicted significant damage, further crippling many key military installations. When the pilots returned, they urged Nagumo to authorize a third attack wave to completely destroy the fuel depots, repair facilities, and logistical infrastructure targets that Americans later judged to be even more strategically important than sinking the battleships. However, Nagumo refused. He feared that prolonging the operation would reveal the fleet's position and give the U.S. aircraft carriers, which happened to be away from the harbor, the chance to return and launch a counterattack from an unexpected direction. He also did not want the fleet to become trapped too far from Japan, while lacking intelligence and adequate support. In the eyes of Japanese command at the time, this was a reasonable act of caution meant to preserve the core strength of the fleet. But from the American perspective, the decision was an invaluable gift. By leaving the fuel depots, harbor facilities, and repair docks intact, the Pacific Fleet was able to recover far more quickly than expected, giving the United States the foundation to shift from a defensive posture to a counteroffensive within just a few months. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Nagumo continued to command Japan's elite carrier force in a series of operations across the Pacific. First, his fleet supported the assault on Guam, an important objective for expanding Japan's control over Micronesia. Next, under pressure to strengthen the newly formed defensive perimeter, Nagumo was ordered to turn toward Wake Island, where Japan's initial attack had been unexpectedly repelled. Once his force arrived, Wake quickly fell, demonstrating the overwhelming power of aircraft carriers when deployed properly. After that, Nagumo pushed the fleet southward and carried out airstrikes on Rabaul, a key Australian-American stronghold in the region. These attacks not only served immediate military goals, but also laid the foundation for the strategic defensive perimeter Japan was attempting to build across the entire Pacific. But the campaign that highlighted Nagumo's role more than any other battle was the Indian Ocean Raid in early 1942. This was the first time Japan had sent such a large carrier force so far west. Under Nagumo's direct command, the four main carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crossed the Bay of Bengal and approached Ceylon, the center of the British Royal Navy's presence in the region. The objective of the campaign was to deliver a powerful blow to the British fleet, disrupt the sea lines connecting the Middle East to Singapore, and weaken Britain's ability to support the Southeast Asian fronts. On the 5th of April, 1942, Nagumo ordered the first airstrike. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft descended on Colombo, the British military capital on Ceylon. Thick black smoke rose from military installations, hangars, and fuel depots struck by the attack. The British attempted to take off and counterattack, but their aircraft were quickly overwhelmed by the Zero fighters. While the air raid was underway, Japanese scouts spotted two British cruisers, HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Cornwall, moving not far from the island. Nagumo immediately dispatched aircraft to pursue them. Both ships were sunk that same afternoon, costing Britain two of its most important warships in the region. Just 3 days later, on April 9, Nagumo launched another attack on Trincomalee, the second major British base on the island. Once again, Japanese aircraft destroyed numerous military installations and sank the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes, along with an escorting destroyer. These successive losses left the entire British force in the Indian Ocean severely weakened. The remaining ships were forced to withdraw far to the west, avoiding the waters now dominated by the Japanese fleet. In less than a week, Nagumo had sunk or heavily damaged numerous British warships, destroyed two major bases, and crippled Britain's defensive strategy in the region. With this victory, Japan virtually controlled the Indian Ocean for a brief period. This opened a vast maritime corridor linking east and west, allowing Tokyo easier access to key shipping routes and expanding its strategic influence beyond East Asia. For the United States and Britain, the Indian Ocean Campaign was the clearest sign that Japan had reached the peak of its naval power in 1942, and at the forefront of these advances, the most prominent name in command was none other than Rear Admiral Chūichi Nagumo. When Japan advanced toward Midway in June 1942, Nagumo once again held a central role in the largest strategic operation undertaken by the Japanese Navy since Pearl Harbor. The campaign was devised by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, with the goal of luring the American carriers out of their bases and destroying them in a decisive battle. On paper, Japan still possessed four main carriers under Nagumo's command: Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiru, the most experienced force Japan still had after the early war campaigns. But the situation by that time had changed completely compared to December 1941. The Japanese had no idea that the United States had already cracked their communication codes. Every plan, movement schedule, and rendezvous point was known to the Americans. As Nagumo approached Midway, the U.S. had already positioned the carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, at a hidden location. The element of surprise, the very advantage that had given Nagumo dominance at Pearl Harbor, was now gone. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, the first Japanese aircraft attacked the Midway base as planned. The strike caused damage, but not enough to disable the island. When the planes returned, the air commanders requested a second attack, this time requiring armor-piercing bombs to finish destroying the defensive installations. But at that exact moment, a reconnaissance report reached Nagumo. Enemy ships sighted. This was the decisive moment of the battle. Nagumo faced two conflicting choices: continue preparing for the second strike on Midway, or immediately convert the entire bomb load, switching from land target bombs to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to attack the newly sighted American carriers. He chose to rearm. It was a complex and time-consuming procedure. The aircraft on deck were pulled back into the hangars to remove their old bombs and attach new weapons, while fuel hoses and ammunition lay scattered across the floor. At that moment, the carrier decks became extremely vulnerable, and all of it happened just as the Americans were preparing to strike. By nearly 10 a.m., American dive bombers suddenly appeared from high altitude. Because the Zero fighters were occupied with lower-level attacks, the sky above the Japanese formation was left almost undefended. The American bombers plunged straight down onto the Japanese carrier decks at the very moment when bombs, torpedoes, and fuel tanks were still scattered everywhere. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soru were hit by direct bombs and erupted into uncontrollable fires. The flames spread rapidly as evaporating fuel ignited and ammunition detonated in chain reactions. Hiru was the only carrier still operational and immediately counterattacked with two airstrikes. inflicting heavy damage on the American carrier Yorktown. However, with only one ship remaining, Hiryu could not change the course of the battle. By the end of the day, it too was sunk after being hit by multiple bombing runs. Japan's four main carriers, the elite core of its navy since the beginning of the war, went down into the ocean along with hundreds of veteran pilots whom Japan had no ability to replace. On the deck of the burning Akagi, Nagumo stood silently, watching the entire disaster unfold before his eyes. For Japan, Midway was the greatest strategic shock of World War II. From the American perspective, it was the decisive turning point, a battle that proved they possessed superior coordination, adaptability, and striking precision compared to their opponent. Midway became the clearest example showing that the speed and flexibility of the U.S. Navy far surpassed the caution and slow adaptation of Nagumo, a man trained for a form of warfare that had already belonged to the past. After the disastrous defeat at Midway, Nagumo's position within Japan's command structure changed significantly. He was no longer entrusted with major offensive operations or key missions involving the carrier forces. Instead, he was reassigned to areas considered less critical, from overseeing the new Pearl Harbor in the Marshall Islands to defensive forces in the Marianas and other bases far from the front lines. This was not an outright demotion, but rather the Navy's quiet way of removing commanders who had lost the High Command's confidence from the strategic center. But as Nagumo was moved away from the major offensive campaigns, the tide of the Pacific War had already turned completely. From late 1942 onward, American power increased at a pace Japan could not hope to match. The new Essex-class carriers were launched one after another, each carrying more aircraft, operating at greater range, and possessing far superior repair and logistical capabilities. At the same time, American aircraft models were being rapidly improved from the Hellcat to the Avenger, causing Japan's early advantage in air combat to fade away. On the ground, U.S. industry was working at full capacity, producing warships, aircraft, and ammunition in quantities many times greater than Japan could achieve. In that context, the Japanese fleet no longer had the capability to launch large-scale offensive operations. Its operational range shrank with each passing month, forcing it into a defensive posture on most fronts. Nagumo, though no longer at the center of command, repeatedly expressed concern about the hold the islands at all costs strategy imposed by Japan's high command. He clearly saw that the gap between the two sides had grown impossible to close. The United States held overwhelming advantages in numbers, logistics, repair capacity, and control of the skies. But in the culture of the Japanese military at that time, questioning strategic decisions or asking for changes in planning was nearly unthinkable. Nagumo's warnings changed nothing. The High Command remained determined to pursue desperate last-stand battles, even knowing they would only delay the inevitable and could not reverse the tide of defeat. Although his reputation had declined, Nagumo was still assigned to command the naval forces in the Marianas, specifically the defense of Saipan in 1944. This was not just an important battle, but the decisive turning point of the entire war. If Saipan fell into American hands, B-29 strategic bombers would be able to take off from the island and strike directly at Tokyo, threatening the very heart of Japan. Nagumo had to coordinate with General Saito Yoshitsugu, who commanded the army forces on the island, to build a comprehensive defensive system. On the 15th of June, 1944, the landing operation on Saipan officially began. From offshore, more than 70,000 American troops from the Marine Corps and Army, supported by heavy naval gunfire and hundreds of aircraft from the Fifth Fleet, simultaneously advanced toward the island's western beaches. American firepower was overwhelming from the very first minute, blasting apart every Japanese defensive position and leveling the trenches before the infantry even set foot on shore. Although the Japanese forces tried to resist, the first defensive positions were almost wiped out within just a few hours. Nagumo and General Saito Yoshitsugu attempted to organize defensive lines deeper inside the island, but the situation deteriorated faster than expected. Japanese air power in the Marianas was almost completely destroyed within the first 2 days. Any aircraft that took off was shot down by American forces almost immediately. Out at sea, the Japanese Navy's attempt to reach Saipan was completely shattered in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a battle the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the enormous number of Japanese pilots shot down. This left Saipan utterly isolated. No reinforcements, no supplies, no chance to counterattack. Throughout nearly a month of fighting, Japanese forces retreated from one position after another. The main defensive lines at Garapan, Mount Tapachao, and the northern jungle regions were all breached after successive combined assaults by American artillery, tanks, and infantry. Japanese ammunition dwindled by the day. Food supplies became critically scarce. Many units could no longer maintain communication with Central Command. Nagumo and Saito had to move constantly between makeshift command bunkers, avoiding shell fire while trying to maintain contact with the remaining forces. Yet every report that reached them showed a situation more desperate than the one before. By early July, the final defensive line at Marpi Point, the northern tip of Saipan, began to collapse. American forces advanced meter by meter, seizing the remaining positions with overwhelming firepower. Meanwhile, the Japanese troops had virtually nothing left with which to fight back. Many units had been reduced to only a few dozen men. Others were forced to use rifles without ammunition or crude, improvised weapons. On the 9th of July 1944, General Saito sent his final message to the remaining units, acknowledging that Saipan had fallen. For Nagumo, who had once commanded the most powerful carrier force Japan had ever possessed, this was a painful but unavoidable moment. He understood clearly that the collapse of Saipan was not merely the failure of a single battle, but a sign that the Mariana defensive line, the last shield protecting the Japanese homeland, had been completely breached. With no path of escape remaining, Nagumo and Saito made their final decision according to the Japanese military tradition of the time. No surrender, no capture alive. In a small bunker surrounded by the thunder of American artillery, amid the ruins of Saipan, Nagumo drew his gun and took his own life. His death marked the end of the journey of a commander who had once held in his hands the greatest naval air power Japan had ever possessed, yet was forced to end his life on an isolated island far from the ocean to which he had devoted his entire career. The Battle of Saipan was not only the final chapter of Nagumo's life, but also a symbol of the decline of the entire Japanese fleet, an armada that had once dominated the Pacific, yet was ultimately defeated by the rapid development and overwhelming strength of the United States in the final stage of the war. Nagumo, a man who had spent his entire life at sea, now faced his final moment far from the waters he once commanded. As the last remaining units were overrun and the sound of American gunfire drew close, he drew his pistol and took his own life inside a small bunker. His death closed a career marked by both resounding victories and decisive defeats. For the Americans, Nagumo's death carried deep symbolic meaning. It marked the end of a generation of Japanese commanders trained for traditional gunnery warfare, but unable to adapt to the era of aircraft carriers and modern strategy. And among those who best represented that disparity, Nagumo was the first name that came to mind. To understand why Nagumo was both brilliantly successful and deeply controversial, one must place him in the exact moment of history. Japan in the 1,930 seconds, 1,940 seconds, was a nation dominated by extreme militarism. Orders mattered more than thinking. Discipline mattered more than flexibility. Nagumo was trained in a world of gunnery-based naval warfare, yet he was pushed into the aircraft carrier era, an era he never chose. He succeeded because under his command was the most carefully prepared strike force Japan had ever assembled, with elite pilots, modern carriers, and plans designed by Yamamoto, a strategist far more visionary than he was. But he became controversial because whenever he faced moments that required decisiveness and creative adaptation, he chose the safer path. Decisions such as refusing a third strike at Pearl Harbor or reacting too slowly at Midway became symbols of that conservatism. Japanese historians later called Nagumo the right man at the wrong time. While for Americans, he became a prime example of how a capable commander can fail when he no longer belongs to the generation of warfare he is fighting. The final image of Rear Admiral Nagumo Chūichi in Pacific War history is that of a commander who once stood at the peak of power, yet ended his life in the shadows of a war that had grown beyond his ability to control. Nagumo's military career clearly reflects the brutal shift between two eras, from the slow, gun-based naval warfare where experience and discipline ruled, to the aircraft carrier age where speed, information, and adaptability rewrote every rule. In the eyes of the Americans, Nagumo was both a dangerous opponent in the early months of the war and a living example of the limitations faced by a generation of Japanese commanders unable to keep up with the new reality. His military career can neither be called genius nor regarded as pure failure. He was a soldier trained for a type of warfare that had already become obsolete, yet he was placed at the center of the most modern conflict of the century. When decisive moments arose from Pearl Harbor to Midway, his inherent caution and fear of losing the core strength of his fleet made him hesitate at the exact times when war demanded absolute decisiveness. And it was precisely those moments that opened the door for the United States to reverse the entire situation in the Pacific, reshaping the course of the war until its very last day. Nagumo passed away in the silence of Saipan, but his story endures as a reminder that in war, strength does not come only from weapons or numbers, but also from the ability to recognize what is changing and to adapt quickly enough before it is too late.